So to get you thinking about submission and roles, I have to tell you about a really, really great illustration that I heard once from an older pastor. He said, let me tell you about once upon a time when there were two lines of husbands in heaven. One for the dominant husbands and one for the passive, submissive husbands. The submissive husband line extended almost out of sight. There was one man in the dominant husband line. Just one. He was small, he was timid, and he appeared to be anything but a dominant husband. So an angel went over to him and inquired as to why he was in the line, and he said, "My wife told me to stand here." It's not a bad piece of advice to tell a man to be sensitive to his wife and to be kind to his wife, and that he is to be the spiritual leader of his home. But very often what happens is there is a role reversal. Now, the role reversal happens for a couple of different reasons, and we'll talk about why here. But what you have is certainly passive men, and because they don't take the lead, wives have to, because somebody has to. But there is also, in all of our natures, a sinful inclination to abandon God's design. This is normal for any good thing. You think of God's design for sex. You think of God's design for money. You think of God's design for relationships and friendships and community and so many other things, like even work. Well, marriage is no different in that the enemy works overtime to get you and I to abandon the original blueprint for it. And one of the ways we do this in marriage is for men to become passive and women to become overly aggressive. Now, in verse 21, just prior to the verses we're going to look at, you'll see, and be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. In other words, we come to the topic of relationships with a humble attitude, a mutual submission towards one another. I want to serve my wife. She wants to serve me. I want to be sensitive and caring and understanding of her needs. She wants to be sensitive, caring, and understanding of my needs. There's this beautiful mutual submission that God has intended for relationships. And while mutual submission is vital, God's design for the home still operates under a headship. And what I mean by that is the biblical definition of headship, which is to oversee, to protect, to care for, to nurture, to set course for. All of that is good headship. And of course, the enemy works overtime to give people a very twisted view of that. In a marriage, you can't have mutual submission to the point of paralysis. Now, some of you, in your own life or your own mind, you call this paralysis by analysis. It's when you're analyzing things so intensely, but you can never come to a conclusion, or you have a difficult time with procrastination, with decision making. Well, if we all just mutually submitted to one another in marriage to the fullest extent, I would look at my wife and say, "What do you want to do?" "I want to mutually submit to you." And she'd say, "Well, what do you want to do?" "I want to mutually submit to you." And I would say, "Well, what do you want to do?" "I want to serve you like Christ." And she's like, "I want to submit to you as unto the Lord." And I say, but I want to sacrifice and lay myself down. Like, who can go lower? And eventually, even the kids are like, "One of you make a decision of what we're eating for dinner." Somebody has to make the call. And ideally, with two people who are filled with the Holy Spirit, wouldn't it be an amazing thing if we both submitted to the Lord and walked by the Spirit and ended up with the right order in marriage? I want to answer two key questions. Really three, but two heavily, and then we'll land on the third one. The first is, what is a godly wife commanded or called to be? There's a calling on you as sisters. Number two, why is she called to be this or commanded to be this? We'll spend most of our time there, and then I'll land the plane with you on the third key question, just to make sure we're clear. How far does this calling or this command go? The reason for that is when we get into the topic of submission, I need to answer for you this question. Do I have to submit into sin? And I want to talk about that to land the plane. Let's answer the first one. What is a godly wife called to be? Number one, in your notes, if you're taking them, wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. Very important. Be subject. It's a passive verb. And what it means is that you are called to be, even commanded to be, is really the fullest force of the verb, willingly submitted to your own husband. Your own. That word hupotasso is to place yourself under willingly someone else. So the godly wife, the biblical wife, God's design is that a wife places herself under her husband. And notice there, a little three-letter word in our English translation. What is it? You could say it out loud. It's very important. Own. Own. Your own husband. Not to everyone else's husband. Not to every man. But your own husband. This is something I tell my little girls. My daughter Grace is 7. She'll be turning 8. I'm taking her to her first women's conference this September. And my little girl Ruthie, she just turned 4 on Monday. Before I flew here, we got to celebrate her birthday. And I'm already talking to my daughters about these things. But my oldest daughter, she has questions because, again, I brought up earlier, my wife is asking me if we can have a 6th child. And, I'm asking her where the money tree is in the backyard. All those fun things. Well, we're having a good time at dinner about this. And Gracie says, Daddy, so I want to get married at 17. And I was like, okay. Maybe 18, okay. But, and she knew what I was going to say, so she puts kind of words in my mouth right away. And she goes, of course, if you and Mom approve, and he's the right guy, and he loves the Lord, and he's godly, all of that. And I said, why? Why so early? Why do you want to leave me? She says, because then I could totally have 6 kids, because you and Mom are so old now, and now you don't want to have any more. But if I'm young, I could have 6 or 7 or even 8. And I said, that's a really, really great plan, sweetheart. And I just kind of looked at my wife as she's like, really? 36? I'm over the hill? Come on here, people. And I said back to my daughter, I said, yes, and you bring up such a good point, sweetheart. I try to use it as an opportunity to talk and reaffirm something we've talked about on our daddy-daughter dates. You one day will be married to a man, and you know how daddy at the weddings that you attend says, who gives this woman to be this man's wife? And the man will say, I do, or her mother and I do, and there's a transfer of oversight or headship or care for that young woman. She is going from being under dad and his protection and guidance and care and mom to being under her own husband. She's going to submit to her own husband. And I always tell her this. I said, do you know that's why we're going to be real strict about what kind of man you marry, because once you leave daddy's oversight and care, you are called, based on what the Bible tells us, to submit to your own husband. I'm not the boss anymore, sweetheart. It's you and him. It's your covenant. It's your marriage. And so we want to submit to the right man. And so if you're in the room and you're a young single woman, understand this. You are under no obligation and no pressure to marry a man for any of the reasons that the world puts forth. You should live with a man before just so you're real sure. That's demonic garbage. And you should make sure that he's really attractive and that he's a great kisser. No, you don't need to worry about any of that. Song of Solomon actually says that in the kissing scene that happens there, that it's post-marriage, and he's aware that her mouth is sweet in that sense, which even gives us God's design that you don't need to take anything for a test drive before marriage, that God has the beauty of his design for relationships and affection waiting in marriage. But the world says, well, you got to do all these things just to know if he's the one. Nope. That'll lead you into submission to the wrong kind of man. By the way, the kind of man that wants all those things before marriage is the exact kind of man you should run from and never submit to, because he couldn't lead you and love you before marriage. What makes you think he could lead you and love you after? These are all very important things. Submit to your own husband. Pick the right one. For all the hoopla that feminism promises and all the power that women have, it says that, Christianity and God's design makes you nothing but a doormat. Actually, sisters, you hold a great deal of power because you get to choose the one you'll submit to. Pick a godly and a good one.